Hello. The topic this week is citizen participation in elections. We're going to be looking at how people participate politically in this country, either by voting or other methods that are discussed in chapter 4. But in this video, I want to focus on the right to vote. Voting is a responsibility of the states. When you register to vote, you're registering with the state where you live, and your voting place is determined by the local precinct that you live in. So the federal government does not run elections. Initially, states restricted voting to white male property owners. That's going back to the early 1800s, late 1700s and early 1800s. You had to be a white male property owner to vote. Gradually, states began to allow non-property owners to vote, but you still had to be a white male. After the Civil War, Congress proposed the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, which guaranteed the right of African Americans to vote. I should note that the 15th Amendment in reality only applied to males, as states at that time did not allow women the right to vote. For a period of time, the right to vote was enforced for all African American men, but then during the Jim Crow period between roughly the 1880s and the 1960s, states, particularly in the South, effectively denied voting rights to most African Americans through literacy tests, poll taxes, and complicated voter registration forms. So even though the 15th Amendment said the right to vote could not be denied to someone because of their race, the reality for most African Americans for about 80 years or so was they could not vote because of these Jim Crow obstacles. In the early 20th century, the women's suffrage movement very actively protested for the right to vote, and in 1920, Congress proposed and the states ratified the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which guarantees the right to vote regardless of gender, so that since 1920, women have had the right to vote. However, the issue of African American voting rights came up again because people recognized that the southern states in particular were not following the 15th Amendment. So in the mid-1960s, as part of the civil rights protests, the protesters demanded really the right to vote, which they should have had all along. And so in 1965, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act, which is still the law today, although it has been limited significantly by the Supreme Court. But it does guarantee the right to vote for all Americans, regardless of race, and the federal government does enforce that right through its actions. As I mentioned, the Supreme Court has scaled that back, and that's a concern, but the right to vote still does exist. In the early 1970s, during the Vietnam War protests, when voting was restricted to 21-year-olds or over, Congress adopted the 26th Amendment to the Constitution, which says that no state can deny someone the right to vote if they're at least 18. So today we say we basically have universal suffrage. If you're, as long as you're a U.S. citizen and not in prison, you theoretically do have the right to vote. We do know that states have implemented a number of laws in recent years that have made it maybe more challenging probably for many people to vote. Voter ID laws, which are very controversial. Many states require that voters show a government-issued ID in order to vote. The argument for that is that it would reduce fraud. The argument against it is that it amounts to a poll tax, since a person has to purchase the ID and may not need the ID for any other reason. The other issue that opponents point out is that voter fraud is virtually non-existent in this country. There are limited examples of it, but never enough to change the outcome of an election. In any event, voting is an important responsibility of all Americans. One of the problems that we have in this country is a lot of people don't vote. In last year's presidential election, it was in the mid-50% range, the turnout, meaning that almost half of Americans stayed home. In the local elections that will be taking place around the area this fall, and in other places, it's likely that turnout will be even lower. So there are a lot of reasons why that is the case. Certainly, some of those are discussed in the chapter, but it is a problem. So that's the issue of voting. Please respond to the question that you have to answer this week. And if you have any questions, email or call me. All right, have a great week.